Welcome back to Intro to Philosophy 1010. Our book is The World of Philosophy, an Introductory Reader by Stephen Kahn. In this video, we are going over the very last pages of Plato's dialogue, the Phaedo. So this starts on page 43 of our book, and the questions that this covers on exam 1, I'm going to read right here, is for part A. What lessons do you think we should take away from the life and death of Socrates as it is described by Plato? Why? Explain. And part B, question 6, what do you think we can learn from Plato's description of the death of Socrates? So part A is a 250-word essay, a minimum of 250 words, and it covers the life and death of Socrates. And so I would assume if you answer part A, you'd probably want to if you answer question 2 for part A, you might as well answer question 6 for part B, because you've got to cover the life and death of Socrates anyway. So the Phaedo is Socrates' death. It ends with him drinking the hemlock. We went over the apology, or the defense of Socrates, where he defended himself against charges of impiety and corrupting the youth. And we went over the Crito, in which his oldest living friend Crito was trying to convince Socrates to escape from prison after he'd been found guilty, unjustly found guilty of corrupting the youth, which he said he wasn't corrupting the youth. Even if he had been, it must have been unknowingly. Who would willingly make people who surround him worse, when then you increase the risk of suffering at the hands of unjust people? So now he's accepted his fate. He was never, even in the defense, he was never all that confident that he was going to get out of there alive. He assumed they were going to find him guilty because he'd spent his whole life showing how powerful people were actually not as wise as they thought they were. They thought they were wise. Socrates would question them in public, proving that they didn't know what they were talking about, that their beliefs weren't consistent with themselves, and they couldn't define their fundamental terms. And that, he said, is what brought about his death. And humiliating powerful people in front of the public is one of the best ways to get yourself killed, he explains several times. Okay, so now here he is, the end result of his somewhat flippant defense to the people who he assumed were going to find him guilty anyway, is drinking hemlock. And it's a long dialogue, and Socrates introduces his theory of the absolute forms of knowledge, which we'll be discussing later in the book, especially when we discuss rationalism versus empiricism. This is just the very end. And so I'll go over this very end part and then maybe bring in a little bit. Well, one thing I will bring in is the entire dialogue is set as a conversation from one of Socrates' students, Phaedo, explaining to another man, Socrates, what happened on the day of Socrates' death. So people are curious, they want to know. So here's Phaedo recounting what had happened. And now we're here at the end of the dialogue. So page 43, when he'd spoken, Crito said, "Very well, Socrates, what instructions have you for these others, or for me, about your children, or about anything else? What could we do that would be of most service to you?" "What I'm always telling you, Crito," said he, "and nothing very new. If you take care for yourselves, your actions will be of service to me and mine, and to yourselves too, whatever they may be, even if you make no promises now. But if you take no care for yourselves and are unwilling to pursue your lives along the tracks, as it were, marked by our present and earlier discussions, then even if you make many firm promises at this time, you'll do no good at all." Okay, so right there, they had just spent the entire day discussing why it's reasonable to assume that the soul exists after the body dies. So Socrates was saying, if you pay attention to what we were just going over, and the reasons why you should believe that your soul is eternal and your body is temporary, and that you should care for your soul much more than your body, which you should perceive as a kind of a prison, which had an extra symbolic meaning, because Socrates was saying that from within a prison, then everything will be fine. You'll be just, and you'll automatically do what's good for yourselves, for my children whom I'm leaving behind, and for me. But if you don't pay attention to the existence of your soul, then no matter what you say you're going to do for my children or for me or for yourselves, it's going to do you no good. Any good things done for the body, he's more or less discounting their overall significance. Okay, so, and I'll go over some of the arguments that there's three basic arguments for the existence of a soul that they had gone over, and I'll talk about them a little bit later. But continuing here, Crito asks, "Then we'll strive to do as you say," he said, "but in what fashion are we to bury you?" "However you wish," said he, "provided you catch me, that is, and I don't get away from you." And with this he laughed quietly, looked towards us, and said, "Friends, I can't persuade Crito that I am Socrates here, the one who is now conversing and arranging each of the things being discussed. But he imagines I'm that dead body he'll see in a little while, so he goes and asks how he's to bury me. But as for the great case I've been arguing all this time, that when I drink the poison I shall no longer remain with you, but shall go off and depart for some happy state of the blessed, this I think I'm putting to him in vain, while comforting you and myself. So please," okay, there he says, "tell Crito that, yes, my soul will be going off and departing and existing somewhere else. That way he won't be so distressed when he sees my body burning or being put into the ground, because he'll know that my soul is free." And then continuing here on page 43, "Because you can be sure, my dear Crito, that misuse of words is not only troublesome in itself, but actually has a bad effect on the soul. Rather, you should have confidence and say you are burying my body, and bury it however you please, and think most proper." After saying this, he rose and went into the room to take his bath, and Crito followed him, but told us to wait. Okay, so how do you want us to bury you or dispose? What do you want us to do with you when you die? So he's calling Socrates' body him, and Socrates is saying we should be careful with the language we use. Don't call yourself your body. For example, if you're driving down down the street in a car, and someone else hits your car with their car, the natural way of speaking would say, you hit me, you blindsided me, you rear-ended me, whatever it is. But Socrates would say he didn't hit you. His car collided with your car. You're not your car. And similarly, and that's a good example because Plato and in other dialogues considers the body to be like a carriage pulled by horses. So it's a vehicle for the soul. So there's his big point. And then he went off to take a bath, and it took a while. And Phaedo says, the rest of us were lamenting that we were about to lose our father. We were like orphans. And then after his bath, Socrates came back, and he conferred with his wife, the women of his household, and 2 little sons and a big one. And then he had them led away. And then he returned to his friends with whom he'd been philosophizing all day. And then a man came in to tell Socrates that when the sun is setting, it would be time for him to drink the hemlock. And so I think this is an important point that Plato adds into the dialogue. The man who's telling him that, this prison guard, he says, "In your time here, I've known you for the most generous and gentlest and best of men who have ever come to this place. And now especially, I feel sure it isn't with me you're angry, but with others, because you know who are responsible. Well, now, you know the message I've come to bring. Goodbye, then, and try to bear the inevitable as easily as you can." And with this, he turned away in tears and went off. Socrates said, "How generous of him to weep for me." And then that's an important point because later we're about to see, after he drinks the poison, all of his friends break down and start weeping, and he chides them for weeping. So he praises the prison guard for generously weeping for him, and he chides his own students or friends. So he's distinguishing between 2 classes of people, the philosophers and then the average person who's not a philosopher. And he praises the virtue of the average person, but the same act he considers a vice in someone who focuses on the nature of the soul. We're going to see in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna tells Arjuna, "The wise lament for neither the living nor the dead," because the soul is what you are. The soul doesn't die. The body dies. That's not the person. Okay, so with that, Socrates says, okay, it's time. After the guard told him, when the sun sets, you'll take the poison. Even though the sun hadn't set yet, he said, okay, let's just get it over with. Go tell him to bring the poison. And Crito said, Socrates, what's the rush? The sun hasn't even set yet. And I've heard that people, they can have dinner late into the night. They can even have sexual relations, is what he alludes to here, with whoever they please before they go. And then Socrates says, it's reasonable for those you speak of to do those things because they think they gain by doing them. For myself, it's reasonable not to do them because I think I'll gain nothing by taking the draught a little later. So Crito nodded to one of his servants, and in a while they came back with the poison. And then Socrates, he asked, can we offer a libation, pour a little bit out on the ground for the gods? And then the guard said, no, we only make enough just right for your body weight. So then Socrates offered up a prayer to the gods, let my transition to the next world be profitable. And with that, he took it perfectly calmly, without a tremor or any change of color or countenance, but looking up at the man and fixing him. Oh, okay, so that was what, he's holding it and he looked at the man, can I offer some libation? And he offered his prayer to the gods, and he drank it off with good humor and without the least distaste. Till then, most of us had been fairly well able to restrain our tears, but when we saw he was drinking, that he'd actually drunk it, we could do so no longer. In my case, the tears came pouring out in spite of myself, so that I covered my face and wept for myself, not for him, but for my own misfortune, and being deprived of such a man for a companion. Even before me, Crito had moved away. Apollodorus, who had been continuously in tears the whole time, he burst forth in a storm of weeping and grieving, which made everyone present break down except for Socrates himself. So Socrates chides them, and then he says, come on, get a hold of yourself. They were ashamed of themselves. They checked their tears. Socrates laid down. They pinched his foot. He couldn't feel it. When the poison would reach his heart, he'd be dead. So by this time, the coldness was somewhere in the region of his abdomen. When he uncovered his face, it had been covered over, and spoke, and this was in fact his last utterance. Crito, he said, we owe a cock to Asclepius. Please pay the debt and don't neglect it. It shall be done, said Crito. Have you anything else to say? To this question he made no answer, but after a short interval he stirred, and when the man uncovered him, his eyes were fixed. When he saw this, Crito closed his mouth and his eyes. And that, Echecrates, was the end of our companion, a man who, among those of his time, we knew was, so we should say, the best, the wisest too, and the most just. Okay, so that's a famous dialogue. It is at the very foundation of Western civilization, Western philosophy. It was incorporated into Christianity by people like St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas. And, okay, so now before I go back over the discussion question, just very briefly, what were the arguments for the existence of the eternal reincarnating soul? That's what Socrates had been discussing with his friends all the entire day leading up to what we just read. There's three main arguments. The argument of opposites come from opposites, the argument of recollection, that knowledge is recollection, and the argument by analogy. So very quickly, opposites come from opposites. It's the nature of reality that anything we experience comes into being from an opposite state. Day comes from night, night comes from day, health comes from sickness, and you become sick after you were healthy. So everything seems to come from its opposite. Well, if that is the general law of the universe, then we know that death comes from life, because living things die. So the implication is that life comes from death. Reincarnation. So the opposites come from opposites. The argument by analogy has to do with his theory of the absolute forms of knowledge, the absolute ideas, which we'll be discussing when we go over the cave allegory in the Republic. And we'll also be talking about it when we discuss epistemology, the study of knowledge. What is knowledge? There's two main schools. Rationalists believe knowledge comes from these absolute ideas imprinted on our souls, absolute forms of knowledge, like absolute equality, absolute beauty, absolute justice, and absolute goodness, which is the ultimate one. So with that in mind, Socrates gives an example. Equality. There's no two things in the universe that are absolutely equal to each other. They're similar to, they're almost equal, but you've never, through your sense organs, you've never seen, smelled, touched, tasted, or heard two things that are perfectly equal. And yet we all have this inborn standard of reason which says, hey, these two things are not perfectly equal. How do you even come to a concept of perfect equality if you've never experienced it? If knowledge comes from your sense perceptions of the world, and you've never and never will perceive perfect equality with your sense organs, then where do we get this idea? So Socrates says, well, it was never taught to us, so we must have been born with it. And if we were born with this knowledge of absolute equality and absolute knowledge of everything you could conceive, then our souls must have existed before we were born. So, and he's leading that, and if you add that to the opposites come from opposites argument, if we existed before we were born, then, and opposites come from opposites, then we will exist after we die. And the knowledge of analogy is the soul is more like these absolute ideas that it perceives. They don't change, they're eternal. They're simple, they're not compounded of parts. It's just the idea of justice. It's not a compound of other ideas. The soul is similarly its own thing. It's not made up of parts. If it was made of parts, it could be disassembled, but the soul is its own singular entity. So those are the three basic arguments. The one that's most important philosophically is the knowledge is recollection of these absolute ideas, the absolute standards by which we judge the relative worth of the many material examples in the world. Okay, so that is a very brief introduction to a very complicated topic, which we will be getting into the details of. But let me go back over these questions. So, exam 1, part A. Question 2, what lessons do you think we should take away from the life and death of Socrates as it is described by Plato? Why? Explain. Part B, number 6. What do you think we can learn from Plato's description of the death of Socrates? So there's an infinite number of ways you could answer that question, or those questions. And as long as you bring in short, pertinent excerpts from the reading, then you're going to get a good grade. So if you say, what lesson can we learn? We can learn that people are gullible and they'll believe anything because they're so driven by the fear of death that nonsensical fairy tales like an eternal soul become seemingly reasonable to them. That's fine if you say that you totally disagree with Socrates and Plato. Just support that with little quotes from the reading to prove to me you read it, you've thought about it, and then you reject it. Or you could say, oh, we can learn that it's reasonable not to fear death, and that we should live life calmly like Socrates, and the worst thing anyone can do to us is to kill our bodies. Nobody can really do any harm to us, the soul, except for ourselves if we allow them to. So that gives you a sense of security and calmness in life, which is, there's so many different ways that you could answer that question. But the way Socrates dies, you can see he's got a sense of humor about it. He's making tiny jokes. He's not afraid of the poison. He takes it down without the least change of the color of his face. He's not sweating, and he's very calm and indeed somewhat eager. He says, no one knows what comes after you die for sure, but I think good reasons to assume the soul will go on to a blessed state, especially if you've been living a life of philosophy and, in his opinion, serving God, because he believed his entire life had been dedicated to serving the god Apollo, because one of his friends went and asked the oracle at the temple to Apollo, is anyone wiser than Socrates? The oracle said, no, no one is. Socrates said, oh, I know that's not true. I'll prove it. He analyzed a seemingly wise politician, and to his surprise, he says, he discovered that that person really wasn't wise, and then he realized, oh, I'm wise because I know I'm not wise, whereas this person thinks he is. And everyone he encountered was in the same condition. That was his service to God. So the fact that he died because he refused to stop serving his God gives him extra confidence that he's heading to a blessed state. And but again, you can interpret it any way you want. Just make sure you bring in pertinent quotes from the book.